The most powerful woman in the room looked down at the old lady who had just fallen, and she laughed. "Just leave her there," Vanessa Sinclair said, her voice smooth as aged wine, her heel gliding past the frail figure curled on the marble floor. "She's nobody." And from the second-floor balcony, Ronan Kavanagh, the man whom all of Chicago both revered and feared, heard every word of it. In a single sentence, that proud beauty had laid bare the very thing he had spent 3 long years searching for and never finding among the loveliest faces in America. Not beauty, but something 1,000 times rarer than beauty. The whole city knew he was looking for a woman to stand beside him, and the whole city had answered by sending its most beautiful, its wealthiest, its most perfectly raised daughters, lined up before him like jewels displayed in a glass case, waiting to be chosen, but not one of them bent down. Not one except a single girl at the very back of the room, a waitress in a worn uniform, her shoes run down at the heel, and a belly heavy with a child near its time. She crossed the entire hall, moving against the tide of the glittering crowd, and knelt beside the stranger, heedless of the ache tightening across her own tired back. What that girl did not know, what no one in the room that night knew, was that the frail old woman in the faded coat was not poor at all. She was the most powerful person in the room, and she had fallen to that marble floor. On purpose. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with those you love, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that heal. The marble floor felt icy beneath Rosa's knees as she knelt, ignoring the biting chill and the sharp ache tightening across her tired back, her hands immediately reaching for the old woman's frail shoulders, supporting her with the tenderness of someone touching the most fragile thing in the world. The elderly woman was trembling, her faded coat hanging crookedly around her, wisps of white hair falling across a face deeply marked by the passing years. Rosa gave no thought to the crowd gathered around them. She didn't care that her belly had grown heavy, or that her back was aching after hours spent standing and carrying trays. She saw only a human being who needed help, and for Rosa, that was reason enough. She slipped one arm behind the woman's back and used the other to steady her delicate elbow, lowering her voice until it became warm, calm, and reassuring. "Don't rush, ma'am. Take your time. I'm right here." The old woman lifted her head, her clouded eyes settling on the young woman's face, and in that brief moment, something passed through them with startling speed, a sharp flash of awareness that didn't belong at all with her helpless appearance. Rosa turned her head and looked around, her gaze sweeping over the guests who stood watching with irritation, as though the scene before them had somehow stained the splendor of their evening. She noticed a tall waiter in a black jacket standing not far away, his arms folded across his chest and his expression indifferent. Rosa called to him, her voice not loud, yet firm enough to command his attention, carrying an unexpected authority from such a small young woman in her faded server attire. "Please bring me a chair and a glass of warm water, quickly." The waiter hesitated, glancing toward the wealthy guests as though deciding whether someone as lowly as Rosa deserved to be obeyed. But there was something in her eyes that made him unwilling to delay any longer, and he turned away. Rosa lowered her gaze again and straightened the coat around the old woman's trembling shoulders, gently rubbing the cold hands that were clenched tightly together. She leaned close to the woman's ear and whispered words meant for no one else, a tender murmur as soothing as a lullaby. "Don't pay any attention to them, ma'am. The people in this room, no matter how much expensive silk and finery they're wearing, aren't worth a single one of your tears. You're more precious than all of them put together." The old woman listened, and her aged hand tightened faintly around Rosa's, a trembling squeeze the young woman mistook for coldness and fear. She couldn't have known that the old heart before her had just been turned upside down, that it had finally discovered the very thing it had traveled all this way to find. The chair arrived. Rosa carefully helped the old woman to her feet, one hand supporting her back and the other holding her elbow. And although the pain in Rosa's lower back clenched in waves, she didn't allow even the smallest sign of it to show. She lowered the woman gently into the chair, adjusted her coat, then took the glass of warm water from the waiter and raised it to her lips. "Drink a little water to warm yourself, ma'am. Slowly, please." The old woman took a small sip, her eyes never leaving Rosa's face, and in that moment, it seemed as though an invisible thread had been tied between them, even though only one of them understood what it meant. The grand hall continued flowing around them with the same indifference as water curling around a stone. The music remained soft and graceful, laughter still rang brightly through the room, and crystal glasses continued to shimmer beneath the chandeliers. Not one of those elegantly dressed people turned back for another look. To them, a poor old woman slipping to the floor and a waitress kneeling beside her had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience, a small blemish on the flawless portrait of the evening, and they had already stepped around it the way people avoided a puddle in the street. Vanessa Sinclair had moved on long ago, the hem of her silk gown sweeping across the marble as her smile turned toward faces she considered more deserving of her attention. But high above them, behind the railing of the second-floor balcony, one pair of eyes continued to watch without looking away. Ronan Kavanagh stood there motionless, his fingers tightening slightly around the polished oak railing. He had witnessed everything, from the moment the young woman had turned against the tide of the crowd to this moment, when she knelt beside the old woman as though nothing else in the world mattered. For 3 long years, countless women had performed elaborate displays of kindness before him, offering carefully measured smiles and rehearsed gestures designed to catch his eye. He had learned to see through them as easily as looking through glass. But the young woman below had no idea that he was watching her. She wasn't performing for anyone. She did those things because she couldn't have acted any other way, and it was that complete lack of awareness that made every movement painfully real. Ronan narrowed his eyes, and for the first time in a very long while, something stirred inside the chest he had believed long since turned cold, a quiet question rising in his mind that even he hadn't expected. Who was she? Ronan Kavanagh wasn't a man easily moved, and he understood that truth about himself better than anyone. 3 long years had passed since the day he decided he needed to find a woman who could stand beside him, not because his heart demanded it, but because the empire resting upon his shoulders required continuity, a name, an alliance strong enough that no one would dare shake it. And throughout those 3 long years, the city had laid before him the finest things that money and bloodline could produce. Daughters with flawless skin, carefully rehearsed stories, eyes trained to glisten at precisely the right moment, and smiles taught to bloom in exactly the right place. He had stood among them like a man surrounded by a garden of artificial flowers, each one perfectly beautiful, yet not one of them carrying the faintest trace of fragrance. He had learned long ago that beauty was the cheapest thing of all that people could buy, that it was sold on every street corner, displayed at every gathering, and that behind those magnificent faces there was often nothing but a cold emptiness no layer of powder or paint could ever conceal. What he sought, the thing he had almost stopped believing he would ever find, was something so rare that he had begun to question whether it truly existed in this world at all, a heart willing to bend down for someone who could offer nothing in return. And then, tonight, in a room filled with people who knew how to step around a fallen old woman as though avoiding a stain, he had seen it. He had seen it with his own eyes in a young woman wearing threadbare work clothes. He was still standing there, his fingers resting on the railing, when his elderly steward, Harold, approached quietly behind him like a familiar shadow. "Is there something you require, sir?" he asked in the deep voice that had served the Kavanagh family for nearly an entire lifetime. Ronan didn't turn around. He merely tilted his chin toward the hall below, where the young woman was still kneeling beside the old lady. "That girl. Who is she?" he asked. Harold looked down, and a faint flicker of surprise crossed his solemn face, because he had assumed his master was asking about one of the young ladies competing for his attention, not someone standing at the very bottom of the social order. "She's only part of the outside catering staff, sir," he replied, lowering his voice slightly as though her name wasn't worthy of being spoken aloud. "The regular service team was short tonight, so they brought in several temporary workers. She isn't on the guest list. She isn't even recorded in the household register. She's merely a waitress hired for one evening. She isn't worth your concern, sir." Ronan remained silent for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the scene below, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped so low it seemed meant for no one but himself. "This room is filled with people who have names, families, wealth, and every advantage the world can offer. Yet tonight 2 different people have told me that someone is nothing. One said it about that old woman, and now you've said it about the girl." He gave a faint shake of his head, one corner of his mouth lifting in a smile that held no warmth at all. "And yet I'm beginning to think that, among all the distinguished people crowding this room, the one they call nobody may be the only person here worth knowing." Harold said nothing, because he had served this man long enough to understand that there were moments when his master spoke without expecting an answer, and it was in that quiet moment, while Ronan's gaze remained intent upon the young woman below, that he noticed something else, something that entered his vision for only an instant, yet was enough to stir the instinct that had kept him alive through so many dangerous years. In a shadowed corner near the row of stone columns on the eastern side of the ballroom, one of his most trusted men, a man Ronan had always relied upon, stood with his head lowered, exchanging a few hushed words with someone wearing a dark suit and the insignia of the Sinclair family. The conversation lasted only a heartbeat, and the moment the Sinclair man finished speaking, something small was passed from one hand to the other, so discreetly that Ronan would never have known if he hadn't happened to look in precisely that direction at precisely that moment. His man lifted his head, swept his eyes around the ballroom to make certain no one had noticed, then calmly disappeared into the crowd. Ronan didn't move. His face remained as cold and still as the surface of a frozen lake. But deep within him, another question had begun to take shape beside the one about the young woman. A question sharp with cold suspicion, accompanied by the uneasy sense that beneath all the glittering light of this evening, something was quietly decaying, something he couldn't yet name. That vague sense of betrayal wasn't unfamiliar to Ronan Kavanagh, because the world he ruled had been built upon the very foundation of loyalty, and he had learned early in life that loyalty was the most fragile thing a person could ever possess. Only earlier that day, before the first cars carrying guests rolled into the gravel courtyard of the Sinclair estate, Ronan had sat in silence behind the enormous walnut desk in the vast study beyond the double wooden doors of his own mansion, and before him stood a man drenched in cold sweat. His name was Cormac, a man who had served in Ronan's ranks for many years, someone Ronan had once trusted enough to place substantial sums of money under his care. The room had been so quiet that the soft crackling of firewood in the hearth and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner could be heard clearly. Ronan didn't shout. He never shouted, because men who truly held power in their hands didn't need to raise their voices to make others tremble. He simply sat there and placed a thin folder of documents before the man, figures that didn't align, sums of money that had quietly flowed into places where they should never have gone, and he looked at him with gray eyes as cold as tempered steel, eyes that held no anger, but something far more terrifying than anger, absolute disappointment. In a low and measured voice, so quiet that Cormac had to lean forward to hear him clearly, Ronan asked whether he knew the most frightening thing about betraying a man like him. The man stammered, unable to form an answer, and Ronan answered his own question. The most frightening thing wasn't the punishment. It was the moment Cormac realized he had lost the only thing that had ever given him value in Ronan's eyes, his trust. And once that was gone, no amount of money in the world could buy it back. The men standing around the room, his most trusted associates, didn't dare breathe too loudly, because every one of them understood what they were witnessing, and they knew that Ronan's calmness in moments like this was more dangerous than any fit of rage. He rose from his chair and walked around the desk, and for a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to stop breathing, but he merely bent down, placed one hand on the trembling man's shoulder, and told him he would leave the city before the night was over, that he would never return, and that he should be grateful Ronan was still allowing him to walk away on his own 2 feet, because others who had sat where he was sitting hadn't been so fortunate. That was how Ronan Kavanagh punished betrayal. Not with theatrical brutality, but with a cold authority that made fear sink deep into a man's bones. And when Cormac was escorted from the room, everyone finally dared to breathe again, though not one of them dared meet Ronan's eyes. But there was one thing every man who followed him understood clearly, a boundary he had never once allowed himself to cross in all those years, and one he never permitted anyone beneath him to cross either. No matter how merciless he might be toward traitors, no matter how many things his hands had done that the outside world could never be allowed to know, he had never, and would never, allow that cruelty to touch a woman, a child, or an innocent person who had never harmed anyone. Once, one of his men, blinded by anger, had threatened the family of a rival, even the man's wife and young child, and Ronan had gone to confront his own subordinate that very night. In that frighteningly quiet voice of his, he told the man that if he ever dared touch so much as a single hair on the head of anyone uninvolved, he would answer directly to Ronan, and the way he said it ensured that the man never dared entertain the thought again, because deep inside Ronan Kavanagh, beneath the ice that years and loss had built around him, something still remained that even he had believed dead long ago, the last fragment of a conscience that refused to be extinguished, a boundary he held on to the way a man might cling to the final memory of the person he might once have become. And perhaps it was because that boundary still existed that, as he stood on the balcony that night, looking down at the young woman kneeling beside the old lady, something inside him stirred. It was faint, barely more than a tremor, but it was enough to make it impossible for him to look away. That boundary, that final fragment of conscience Ronan held on to like a silent vow, hadn't appeared without reason. It had been born from a wound so old that he had once believed it had healed long ago, though whenever night fell and the mansion sank into silence, he could still feel it smoldering beneath the surface like a burn that had never truly cooled. He remembered clearly the time before he became the man all of Chicago treated with caution, when he was still a young man who trusted the people around him. When his father, Declan Kavanaugh, still held the reins of the entire family, and Ronan still believed loyalty was something worth wagering one's life upon. His father had been a hard man, but not a heartless one, and what brought him down wasn't an enemy from outside, nor a bullet fired from the darkness by a rival, but the hand of the very man he trusted most, someone who had sat at the family table for years, who had held Ronan in his arms when he was a boy, and whom his father had regarded as a brother by blood. That man had sold Declan out for greed and for the promise of power, and on that fateful night, when his father fell before he could even understand why the person he trusted above all others had turned against him, something inside the young Ronan shattered as well, something that would never be made whole again. But while his father's death had taught him that trust was a deadly luxury, what happened afterward was what truly froze his heart into something hard and numb. He had a younger sister named Aifa, many years his junior, a girl with a clear, radiant smile, and a heart that had never been stained by the darkness surrounding their family, the only person who still made him believe that something decent continued to flow through Kavanaugh blood. He had sworn to protect her at any cost, to keep her forever beyond the reach of the bloody purges within the empire he had been forced to inherit. But he hadn't been able to keep that promise, because during the chaos that followed, while different powers fought over the seat his father had left behind, Ronan's enemies understood that the surest way to strike his heart wasn't to aim at him, but at the person he loved most. The night he received the news, he drove through a torrential rain, racing along soaked streets with his heart pounding wildly inside his chest, praying to a higher power he had long since stopped believing in. But by the time he arrived, it was already too late, only a little too late, delayed by that single brief moment that separates having from losing, and the sight that met him that night followed him for the rest of his life, becoming the nightmare that returned again and again whenever he closed his eyes. He knelt beside his sister in the rain, gathered her into his arms, and called her name until his voice turned raw, but no cry could bring her back, and in the deepest moment of that agony, something inside Ronan Kavanaugh died with her. From that fateful night onward, he carved a lesson into his heart as though cutting it into stone, that kindness was a fatal weakness, that loving someone meant placing a knife in an enemy's hand and inviting them to use it against you, and that only those who had nothing left to lose and no one left to love could ever be truly safe in such a merciless world. And so he sealed his heart shut, building walls around it, so high and thick that no one could reach him, turning himself into the cold man the entire city both respected and feared, a man who believed he would spend the rest of his life in the solitude he had chosen, accepting it as both the price he had to pay and the only shield capable of protecting him. His reluctant search for a wife over the past 3 years had been driven only by duty to his bloodline, not because he still believed his heart could ever stir again, and he had been certain that the part of him capable of love had been buried forever beneath the rain of that long-ago night. Yet tonight, as he stood on the balcony and watched an unknown young woman kneeling beside a poor old lady, he suddenly felt a faint crack form in the stone wall around his heart, fragile but real, and it left him bewildered and frightened in a way he hadn't experienced for a very long time. While a faint crack formed in Ronan's frozen heart high above the ballroom balcony, on the other side of the city. After the celebration had ended and the crystal lights had gone dark behind her, Rosa quietly returned to the place she called home, a cramped rented room on the top floor of an aging apartment building in a neighborhood none of the evening's wealthy guests would ever dare enter. She climbed the rickety staircase as it creaked beneath every step, one hand gripping the icy railing while the other supported the heavy curve of her pregnant belly, and with each stair, the ache in her lower back reminded her that she had spent the entire long evening on her feet. Her room welcomed her with its familiar cold because the heater had been broken for so long and she didn't have enough money to repair it, with the spreading water stains across the ceiling whenever it rained, and with the sickly yellow light of the street lamp below filtering through a window that didn't even have a proper curtain. She slipped off the shoes whose heels had been worn almost flat, shoes she had used until the leather split but continued sewing back together so they might last a little longer, then sank onto the narrow bed pushed against the wall and allowed exhaustion to seep into every part of her body. Rosa had never known what a real home felt like. No one had ever gathered her into loving arms and called her daughter with the tenderness of blood and family, because she had been abandoned outside the doors of an orphanage when she was still an infant, with no note left behind and no name belonging to the woman who had given birth to her. She grew up among rows of narrow beds and the faces of children who came and went, teaching herself how to braid her own hair, wipe away her own tears, and comfort herself through the long nights when other children were chosen and taken home, while she remained behind, year after year, until she grew too old for anyone to want to adopt her. The only person who had ever extended a hand toward her in that cold world was a woman she called Aunt Bernadette, a distant relative. Rosa wasn't even certain truly shared her blood, who took her in shortly after she reached adulthood and had nowhere else to go. Rosa loved that woman with all the desperate longing of someone who had spent her whole life yearning for a family. She regarded her as the only family she had in the world and worked day and night to help support her, because to a child who had never belonged to anyone, having even one person willing to claim her could feel like being given the entire sky. But Rosa never imagined that her longing to belong would become the chain that bound her to a tragedy she had done nothing to create, because one day Aunt Bernadette quietly used Rosa's name and took advantage of her innocent trust to borrow a large sum of money from people no one should ever become indebted to, then vanished from the city like smoke, leaving the young woman alone beneath a mountain of debt and at the mercy of collectors who had never understood the meaning of compassion. From that day forward, Rosa's life became a race with no finish line. She accepted every job anyone was willing to give her, working the day shift at a small diner before taking on extra nights, serving at gatherings like the one she had just left, draining every last measure of strength from her body to gather one small bill after another, not because she dreamed of a better life, but simply so those debt collectors wouldn't come knocking on her door again. And yet, in the midst of all that exhaustion and darkness, when Rosa lay back on the old bed and let her eyes drift half-closed, she suddenly felt a faint movement beneath the hand resting on her belly, one tiny kick, soft as the touch of a butterfly's wing against her skin, and in that moment, every hardship in the world seemed to disappear. A smile quietly formed on her lips, a smile so tender that anyone who saw it might never have believed it belonged to a woman carrying such a crushing burden, and she placed both hands over her stomach, whispering to the little life inside her that even if the whole world turned its back on her mother, the baby would still be there with her. And as long as she had her child, she would still have a reason to keep moving forward. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness of that freezing room, she allowed herself to dream a small and simple dream so painfully modest that it could break the heart. A dream that one day, when her baby was born, she would have a warm room with a window overlooking the sunlight, and she wouldn't need anything more than that. That modest dream of a sunlit window was all Rosa still allowed herself to hope for, because she had learned through bitter experience that dreams any larger than that only brought greater pain when they shattered, and no dream had ever broken more cruelly than the day she realized the man to whom she had entrusted all her faith had quietly abandoned her at the very moment she needed him most. His name was Shane, a man with an easy smile and sweet promises that she, with the yearning heart of someone who had never truly belonged to anyone, had believed with blind devotion. She had thought that at last she had found someone who would stay, someone who would help her build the home she had longed for all her life. And for one brief stretch of time, she had allowed herself to be happy, had allowed herself to believe that perhaps fate might finally smile upon her. But on the day she tremblingly told him that she was going to become a mother, that a tiny life was growing inside her, she didn't see the joy she had always imagined appearing on his face. Instead, there was only a cold silence, an evasive gaze, and not long afterward, he vanished from her life without a word of farewell, leaving her to face the news alone, just as she had always faced every upheaval in her life alone. The pain of being abandoned wasn't new to Rosa, but this time it cut deeper than all the others, because it carved even more deeply into the bitter belief that had taken root within her since childhood. The belief that everyone would eventually leave her, that she was the kind of person others could easily walk past and leave behind, that no matter how much she loved or how much she gave, she would always end up standing alone. And what tightened her heart most wasn't only that he had gone, but that this wasn't the first time she had carried within herself the hope of a child. There had been another life before this one, another hope, and she had lost that little soul before it ever had the chance to be born. A silent grief she had never shared with anyone, a wound she had buried so deeply that at times even she didn't dare touch it. That was why this pregnancy, to Rosa, wasn't merely another burden layered upon all the burdens she already carried. It was something sacred and so fragile that she barely dared breathe for fear of losing it, the final miracle that a harsh and unrelenting life had still chosen to grant her. The doctor at the charitable clinic she visited had looked at her with concern and warned her that her body was weak, that the pregnancy carried many risks, that she needed rest and proper nourishment, that she must stay away from exhausting work and long nights spent standing on swollen feet. Advice Rosa had listened to with a sad smile, because she understood that such things were luxuries far beyond her reach. She didn't have the right to rest. She didn't have anyone to care for her, and every additional shift she accepted was a gamble placed against her own health and the health of her unborn child. But she had no other choice, because if she stopped, neither she nor the baby would have anything left to hold on to. And yet, in the midst of all that fear and loneliness, the unborn child was the only flame keeping her heart from going cold, the only reason she could still force herself to rise each time life knocked her down. Whenever she felt herself close to collapsing, whenever the darkness of despair nearly swallowed her whole, a tiny kick, a faint movement from within, would pull her back, reminding her that she wasn't truly alone, that there was a small life depending entirely upon her, needing her to be strong more than anything else in the world. And so Rosa, the young woman the world had turned its back on more times than she could count, continued to lift herself after every fall, not because she still believed in a bright future for herself, but because she had quietly poured into that little life every drop of love she herself had never received, and she made a promise in the silence of her heart that her child would never, not for a single day, have to know the feeling of being abandoned that she had carried throughout her entire life. The quiet love Rosa poured entirely into her unborn child, the kindness she had somehow kept intact even though life had never given her a single reason to remain kind, turned out to be the very thing someone else had been searching for in silence. Because only a few days after that fateful night at the party, an elderly woman in a simple coat walked into the small diner where Rosa worked during the day and took a seat at a table beside the window, as though she were merely an old customer who had happened to stop by in search of a place to rest. No one in the diner paid any attention to her, and that was exactly what she wanted, because Maureen Kavanagh had lived long enough to understand that people revealed who they truly were only when they believed no one important was watching. She hadn't been able to forget the young woman who had knelt beside her on the cold marble floor, and she hadn't been able to drive from her mind that gentle voice whispering in her ear that she was more precious than all the splendid people in that room put together. She had quietly asked questions until she discovered where the young woman worked, not because she wanted to repay a favor, but because she needed to see with her own eyes whether the kindness Rosa had shown her that night had been nothing more than a passing impulse, or whether it was truly part of who she was. And so she sat there, silent as a shadow beside the window, her aged but perceptive eyes following every movement Rosa made as she walked between the tables with the heavy weight of her pregnancy before her, exhaustion clearly visible on her face, though her patience never once faltered. Before long, at a table in the corner of the diner, a well-dressed middle-aged man began to raise his voice, his tone sharp and condescending, as he complained that his meal had taken too long to arrive, that his coffee wasn't hot enough, and that this miserable little place didn't know the first thing about proper service. Each word deliberately loud enough to make everyone nearby turn and look. Maureen watched with a faint frown, because she had seen countless people like him throughout her life, people who tried to make others feel small so they could feel taller themselves, and she was curious to see how the exhausted young woman would respond to someone so unpleasant, especially when Rosa's own life seemed ready to collapse beneath the weight it had placed upon her. But Rosa didn't scowl. She didn't show irritation, and she didn't answer with the bitterness the man fully deserved. She walked to his table, bent toward him with genuine sincerity, and in the same soothing voice that had once comforted an elderly woman on a marble floor, she apologized for the delay, explained that the kitchen was overwhelmed that day, then personally brought him a fresh cup of coffee, steam rising from its surface, and placed it before him with a gentle smile that held no trace of strain. She went on to say that he must have had a long and difficult day, and that she hoped a warm cup of coffee might help him feel a little better, and there wasn't the slightest hint of mockery or pretense in the way she said it. There was only sincere compassion for a man who was behaving badly, as though she could see through the unpleasant shell he wore and reach the hidden weariness beneath it. Then something remarkable happened, because the middle-aged man, who had been glaring only moments before, suddenly went still. The anger on his face visibly softened, and he stammered an awkward word of thanks before lowering his eyes to his coffee in silence, as though even he were startled by the kindness he hadn't deserved to receive. Sitting quietly in the corner of the diner, Maureen Kavanagh witnessed the entire exchange, and once again she felt her aging heart turn over inside her chest, this time even more powerfully than it had on the night of the party. She understood that kindness offered to someone powerful, or even to a helpless old woman, might still be calculated. But kindness given to someone who was insulting her, someone who could offer her nothing in return, at a moment when she herself was carrying the weight of a shattered world upon her shoulders, was true kindness. The kind that couldn't be performed, couldn't be imitated, and could only flow from a heart that had been made that way from the beginning. Maureen sat motionless as she watched the young woman, her eyes filling with tears that Rosa never noticed, and she thought quietly to herself that she had found the right person at last, the very person she had been searching for all this time. But the warm moment Maureen had just witnessed didn't last long, because just as the middle-aged man began to calm beside his cup of coffee, the diner door flew open with a harsh bang, and a man strode inside with the swagger of someone accustomed to treating every place he entered as though it belonged to him and existed for him to dominate. He had a heavy, muscular frame packed into a dark leather coat. His hair was cut close against his skull, and a long scar slashed diagonally across his left cheek, all the way down to his chin, giving his face a cold and threatening look even before he spoke. His eyes swept around the diner and stopped abruptly on Rosa, and a twisted smile spread across his lips as he marched straight toward her, paying no attention to the wary glances of the customers around him. The moment Rosa looked up and saw him, all the color drained from her face. Her hands trembled beneath the stack of plates she was carrying, and she hurriedly set them down on the nearest table as though afraid she might drop them. The man stopped directly in front of her, standing far closer than necessary, lowering his large head until his face was near hers, then speaking in a rough, oily voice that he deliberately kept low enough to carry a threat, yet loud enough for everyone nearby to hear and feel afraid. He told her she had been hiding long enough, that the debt wasn't going to disappear simply because she pretended it didn't exist, that the people he worked for were beginning to lose patience with her, and that she had better find a way to settle matters before things became far uglier. Rosa fought to keep her voice from breaking. She told him she was trying, that she was still working every day to gather enough money to make payments, that she was asking him to give her a little more time, and without realizing it, one of her hands rose to cradle her pregnant belly in an instinctive gesture of protection. The man noticed the movement, but instead of softening, he curled his mouth into a cruel smile and said that her condition wasn't his concern, that a debt remained a debt no matter how many burdens she carried, and that the men he worked for weren't the kind to be moved by the tears of a woman. Rosa bit down on her lip until she tasted blood. Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let even one of them fall in front of him, because she knew that if she broke down, if she allowed fear to take hold of her, the strain wouldn't be good for the tiny life growing inside her, and she would rather endure every ounce of humiliation herself than allow her child to suffer even the slightest harm. She drew in a deep breath, forced her wildly beating heart to calm, and with every trace of dignity she still possessed, she repeated her promise that she would find a way to pay the debt. Her voice was quiet, but it wasn't pleading. Her restraint didn't come from cowardice, but from the fact that she had something far more precious to protect. The scarred man stared at her for another long moment, as though he wanted to carve her fear into his memory. Then he straightened and growled, one final warning that the next time he returned, he wouldn't be as polite as he had been today. Then he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving behind a heavy silence, and Rosa standing motionless, her shoulders trembling faintly as she struggled to contain everything rising inside her. And in the corner beside the window, Maureen Kavanagh had witnessed every moment of the confrontation. Her aged hands tightened against the tabletop, and in her perceptive eyes there was not only compassion for the young woman, but something else as well, a cold and sharpened attention, as she quietly committed every detail of the scarred man's face to memory, his walk, his voice, and the way he had spoken about the unseen men he served. Because Maureen Kavanagh wasn't merely a compassionate old woman, she was also the mother of the most powerful man in the city, and something in the way that man had referred to his employers had stirred the instincts she had honed over many years, leaving her with a dark premonition she couldn't yet name. That dark premonition proved to be closer than Maureen had imagined, because when Rosa's shift ended and the sky had deepened into the dark violet of fading evening, the elderly woman remained on the steps outside the diner to wait for her, claiming that she merely wanted to thank the kind young woman who had brought her a cup of hot tea that afternoon. And the two women, one old and one young, stepped together onto the narrow street as it slowly emptied of people. They had walked only a few steps, speaking softly beneath the streetlights that had just flickered to life, when three broad figures suddenly emerged from the pitch-black alley beside the diner, their movements quick and purposeful, and Rosa immediately felt the dense atmosphere of danger rolling from them like cold air rising from a block of ice. What made her heart tighten wasn't that they were coming for her, but that their cold eyes were fixed upon the elderly woman beside her, and one of them was already striding forward with his massive hands outstretched as though he intended to seize Maureen's frail body. In that perilous instant, Rosa didn't think of running to save herself, though that might have been the wisest thing anyone in her position could have done. Instead, driven by a fierce instinct to protect that rose from the deepest part of her, she stepped directly in front of the old woman and spread her arms wide like a fragile shield, while one hand still curved protectively around her pregnant belly. She lifted her face and looked straight at the man advancing toward them, and with all the courage she could gather, she spoke in a voice that trembled but remained firm, telling them that whoever they were and whatever they wanted, they weren't allowed to touch the old woman, that she was only an elderly lady who had never harmed anyone, and that if they possessed even the smallest trace of conscience, they would leave her alone. The unexpected bravery of a small pregnant woman made the three men hesitate, as though they hadn't imagined that such a reckless obstacle would place itself between them and their target, and that single moment of uncertainty changed everything. From the far end of the street, a gleaming black car came racing toward them so quickly that its tires shrieked against the pavement, and before it had fully stopped, the door flew open and a tall figure stepped out with the long, decisive strides of a predator that had sensed danger threatening its territory. It was Ronan Kavanagh, and the moment he saw the elderly woman trapped against the wall and the young woman risking herself to shield her, something ignited in his gray eyes like a cold flame, because the woman being threatened was none other than his own mother. He didn't speak. He didn't waste a second. He drove straight into the middle of them with the astonishing strength and precision of a man far too familiar with moments balanced between life and death. And the three violent attackers, though they outnumbered him and were larger, couldn't withstand the controlled fury descending upon them. In the span of a few breaths, the first man was struck down and sprawled across the pavement. The second stumbled backward, clutching his arm, and when Ronan's men poured from the car to support him, all three attackers understood that they had chosen the wrong victim and the wrong fateful night. They hurriedly fled into the darkness of the same alley from which they had appeared, leaving behind a street so silent it felt unnerving. Ronan didn't pursue them, because in that moment, the only thought in his mind was reaching his mother. He wrapped his arms around her trembling, slender shoulders, his eyes quickly searching every part of her to make certain she hadn't been harmed, and only when he knew she was safe did he look up. His gaze met the young woman who was still standing there, one hand cradling her belly, her face pale with fear, while her eyes continued to shine with the same determination he had seen in her that night. And when he realized that the woman who had just risked her own life to protect his mother was the same humble waitress whom he couldn't forget, something tightened inside Ronan Kavanagh's chest, a feeling both unfamiliar and overwhelming, something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. And in that very instant, he knew his life had just touched something from which he would never be able to turn away. Once the street had fallen quiet again, and Ronan's men had spread out to guard both ends of the road, he slowly released his mother from his embrace, and while the elderly woman was still trying to steady herself after the terror they had just endured, he turned fully toward the young woman, his gray eyes settling on her face with an intensity that surprised even him. He had recognized her from the very first second he stepped out of the car, but only now, when the danger had passed, did he truly allow the reality of it to sink in, that the girl standing before him with trembling shoulders and one hand still pressed protectively over her belly was the same young woman in the worn uniform whom he had watched without looking away from the balcony that night, the only person in that magnificent room who had bent down beside someone everyone else believed wasn't worth their concern. And now, once again, not within the safety of a ballroom but on a dark street where danger had been waiting, she had done the very same thing. She had placed herself between danger and someone she believed to be a poor old woman who could offer her nothing in return. Ronan had spent his entire life surrounded by people who measured profit and loss in every gesture, people who acted only when they were certain there was something to gain, and what the young woman had just done, an act born entirely from instinct, without calculation or selfish purpose, struck the stone wall around his heart with such force that he felt another crack form within it, deeper than the one from the night before. He asked whether she had been hurt, and somehow the voice that was usually so cold it could terrify an entire city carried a gentleness when he spoke to her that even he didn't realize he possessed, a concern escaping against his will in the way his eyes moved over her body, searching for any sign of injury. Rosa shook her head and said she was all right, her voice still trembling, but instead of worrying about herself, the first thing she did was turn toward the elderly woman, reach out to support her elbow, and ask whether she was hurt, whether anything was painful. Her face filled with sincere concern for someone she had met only a few times. That gesture, that way she forgot her own fear and thought of someone else first, left Ronan watching her in silence for a long moment, and he suddenly understood that her kindness wasn't something she put on for special occasions. It was an inseparable part of who she was, something that flowed from her as naturally as breathing, no matter what circumstances surrounded her. Maureen, though still shaken, took the young woman's hand and assured her that she was unharmed, that it was because of Rosa that she was safe, then looked toward her son with a meaningful expression only the two of them understood, a look that seemed to say, "Do you see now? I told you." Ronan understood his mother's gaze, but he didn't reveal to Rosa that the old woman she had just risked her life to protect was the mother of the powerful man standing before her, because somewhere deep inside him, something warned him that the purity within this young woman was so precious that he didn't want it stained even slightly by any awareness of rank or power. He wanted to preserve this moment, when she still saw him and his mother simply as ordinary human beings, not as a powerful crime lord and the woman who had given birth to him. He merely told her that he would take both of them home safely, that the street was no place for a woman to walk alone tonight, and when Rosa hesitated and tried to refuse, saying she didn't want to cause any trouble and that her home wasn't far away, he insisted with such gentle firmness that she couldn't deny him, then motioned for one of his men to open the car door. Throughout the drive to her home, Ronan remained silent, but his eyes kept drifting almost unconsciously toward the young woman sitting close to the corner of the seat, her hands resting lightly over her belly, in that habitual gesture of protection, and inside the heart of a man who had long told himself it was already dead. A small spark of life he had believed extinguished forever began to stir. It was a feeling both sweet and deeply unsettling, because he knew that allowing someone into his heart also meant giving the world a new weakness to use against him, and that was something he had sworn for years he would never permit to happen again. That sense of unease didn't come only from the unfamiliar stirrings awakening in his heart, but also from a cold question that clung to Ronan throughout the entire night after he had taken both women somewhere safe, a question he couldn't push aside. Why had those three men known exactly where his mother would be, and why had they gone straight for her on a street where no one beyond his most trusted circle should have known she would appear? Maureen Kavanagh wasn't a careless woman. She had disguised herself, had kept her movements secret, and her visits to the small diner where Rosa worked had been something she believed no one else knew about. Yet they had still found her. There could be only one explanation. Someone very close to Ronan had leaked the information, and the instant that thought formed in his mind, Ronan remembered the fleeting moment at the Sinclair party, the scene he had caught for only a second before his attention was drawn away by the sight of the young woman kneeling beside the old lady, one of his trusted men bowing his head to whisper with someone wearing the Sinclair insignia, while a small object was passed discreetly from one hand to the other. The instinct he had set aside that night now returned with twice its former weight, and Ronan understood that he couldn't entrust this matter to anyone else. He couldn't trust anyone at all, because the traitor might be the very person he was about to assign to the investigation, so he decided to follow each clue himself, moving quietly and patiently like a hunter tracking an animal's footprints through snow. He began with the three men who had carried out the attack that night, ordering their movements traced through the city's shadows, and before long, he located one of them hiding in an abandoned warehouse near the harbor. Ronan went there himself in the middle of the night, entering the dark, damp building alone, with the calm certainty of a man who knew he held the power of life and death in his hands. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to resort to brutality. His cold presence alone, and the reputation that arrived before his name, were enough to make the man tremble and confess everything he knew. What the man revealed left Ronan standing motionless, because he admitted that they had been hired, that whoever stood behind the attack had paid them generously. But what made the blood in Ronan's veins turn cold was hearing that the money had come through a network, an underground loan shark operation working quietly in the darkness of the city, a many-armed monster that had strangled countless desperate people. Worst of all, that operation was functioning under the name of the very organization Ronan commanded, using his name to spread fear while he himself had known absolutely nothing about it. Ronan stood in the darkness of the warehouse as a cold fury rose inside his chest, because he understood exactly what this meant. It meant that within the empire he had built upon his own iron principles, the empire in which he had always guarded a boundary no one was permitted to cross against the innocent, A hidden rot had been growing behind his back. Someone had been exploiting his power to do the very thing he despised most, extorting and threatening vulnerable people who had no means of defending themselves. He thought of the scarred man his mother had described, the one who had threatened Rosa in the middle of the diner, and of the lending network tightening its grip around that poor young woman, and a terrible suspicion began to take shape in his mind. A single red thread, connecting events that had seemed unrelated. Ronan left the warehouse before dawn had begun to break, his face as cold as ice while a storm raged within him, and he told himself that no matter who the traitor was, no matter how close to him the man might be hiding, he would drag him out of the darkness and make him pay, not only because he had dared threaten Ronan's mother, but because he had turned the Kavanagh name, the name Ronan had struggled to keep unstained by the blood of innocence, into a weapon used to torment the very people he should have protected. The faint red thread connecting those scattered events, which Ronan had sensed as he left the warehouse that night, soon became clearer than he had expected, because in the days that followed, as he quietly tightened the net around the loan shark operation hiding beneath the protection of his own organization, he ordered his men to gather every name and every face belonging to those who collected debts on the streets, and among the photographs placed upon his desk, one face made him stop for a long while. A broad, muscular man with a long scar running diagonally from his left cheekbone down to his chin. Ronan immediately recognized him as the man his mother had described in painstaking detail after the afternoon she witnessed Rosa being threatened in the middle of the diner. The man who had leaned close to the young woman's face and spoken cruelly about a debt she had never borrowed. The man who had referred to the unseen masters standing behind him. Now that his name and history were laid out clearly in black and white before Ronan, he understood that this wasn't some solitary debt collector who had wandered into Rosa's life by chance, but a link buried deep within the treacherous network he was hunting. The discovery left Ronan motionless, because it meant that the debt weighing upon the young woman's shoulders, the burden that had drained her strength through every late shift, the fear that forced her to endure humiliation in front of strangers with her teeth clenched, wasn't simply another cruel accident of fate, as he had once believed. It had grown from the very rot spreading behind his back, from the very men who had used the Kavanagh name to sow suffering. He ordered a deeper investigation into the debt carried under Rosa's name, and what he uncovered made his fury rise even higher, because he discovered that the original loan, the one her aunt had placed in Rosa's name by taking advantage of her trust before disappearing, had been mercilessly inflated through layers of outrageous interest, turning an already unjust debt into a noose tightening around the throat of a young woman whose only crime had been daring to trust someone she believed was family. To those running the operation, Rosa was nothing more than a small number in a thick black ledger, a vulnerable victim who could be drained easily, one among countless desperate people they treated like drops of water to be squeezed until nothing remained. That cold indifference, that way they transformed human misery into money flowing into their own pockets, made Ronan despise the hidden leader he still hadn't identified even more deeply. Yet amid that anger, something else was also growing inside him, a powerful urge to protect the young woman he now understood to be an innocent victim of the very dark world he ruled. And Ronan quietly began to act, not by appearing before Rosa and announcing that he would rescue her, because he knew she was proud enough never to accept charity, but through unseen measures she knew nothing about. He ordered his men to watch over her discreetly from a distance, preventing the shadows of that operation from ever drawing near her again. He placed guards along the street where she lived, and near the diner where she worked, building an invisible shield around her that she couldn't see. And the scarred man, the one who had dared bend down and threaten a pregnant woman, received Ronan's particular attention because he had openly trampled upon the boundary Ronan had sworn would protect the vulnerable. And Ronan promised himself that the day would come when the man would answer for every threat he had poured upon that young woman. But even as he tightened the net and raised that shield around her, Ronan kept every action hidden in darkness, because he didn't yet want Rosa to know that the man whose mother she had risked her life to save was the very person holding the power to determine the fate of the operation tormenting her. He wanted to protect her without making her feel indebted, wanted to give without demanding gratitude, and that quiet desire, that awkward tenderness of a man who had forgotten how to care for another person, was the clearest sign that his frozen heart was slowly thawing, little by little, even though he still didn't dare admit it to himself. But the deeper Ronan dug into that dark network, the farther he followed its tangled threads as they wound through every corner of the city, the more truths he uncovered that made even him, A man who had believed he had already witnessed every dark face this world could show, shudder with horror. And the most terrible truth of all, the one that left him sitting in silence for a very long time before the documents his men had brought him, was the truth about the man who had abandoned Rosa. The man named Shane, whom she had always believed, had cowardly turned his back on her when he learned she was pregnant. Ronan discovered that Shane hadn't simply disappeared from her life as she had believed all this time. He wasn't merely a selfish man who had fled from responsibility and quietly gone elsewhere in search of a new life. The truth behind his disappearance was far darker and far more tragic than that. The clues Ronan gathered gradually revealed that before Shane met Rosa, he had been a minor link in the very loan shark network Ronan was investigating. A low-level errand man hired to carry messages and collect small payments. During that work, Shane had accidentally learned too much. He had seen too many things that someone in his insignificant position was never supposed to know. He had uncovered names, figures, and secrets powerful enough to bring the entire operation crashing down if they ever reached the outside world. And when the hidden leaders realized that he knew too much, that he had become a threat to their safety, they eliminated him with cold and silent efficiency, erasing him from this world as casually as someone might erase an unnecessary line from a page. The disappearance Rosa had endured as the betrayal of a coward was, in truth, the tragic end of a man who had paid for what he knew with his own life. Ronan sat there with his gray eyes fixed on the documents before him, and a bitter cold spread through his chest as the full shape of the tragedy slowly came together, because he understood that this wasn't merely a painful truth about Rosa's past. It carried a horrifying meaning for her present and her future as well. If Shane had been killed because he knew too much, then those who controlled the network could never feel safe until they were certain he hadn't revealed those secrets to anyone. And Rosa, the woman who had once been closest to him, the woman carrying his child, would appear in their suspicious eyes as a dangerous loose end that needed to be removed. The ambush on the dark street, the debt deliberately inflated to tighten around her, the men who continued circling the edges of her life, all of it suddenly appeared beneath a new and far more terrifying light. Ronan realized that perhaps his mother hadn't been their only target that night. It was entirely possible that Rosa herself had been one of the people they were secretly watching, a victim they intended to drive into desperation, so the deadly secrets Shane once possessed would remain buried forever. And the most heartbreaking irony was that Rosa knew nothing about any of it. She continued dragging herself through each day, believing she was only a woman abandoned by the man she loved, a desperate debtor trying to escape those demanding payment, never knowing that the tiny life she was fighting so fiercely to protect had unintentionally made her a threat in the eyes of the most ruthless people in the city, never knowing that cold and watchful eyes were following her every step. Ronan clenched his hand into a fist upon the desk, and in that moment, he understood that protecting her was no longer merely a gentle and uncertain impulse born from a heart beginning to thaw. It had become an urgent race against time, because the danger surrounding her was no longer just a debt or an empty threat. It was a silent death sentence hanging over the head of an innocent woman and the unborn child she carried, and he knew he had to act. He had to move faster than the people hiding in the darkness, before it was too late. While Ronan was quietly racing against time to build a shield of protection around her, Maureen Kavanagh, the woman who had set this entire story in motion with a deliberate fall upon the marble floor, decided that the time had come when she could no longer hide her true identity from the young woman she had grown to love as dearly as her own daughter. She arranged for Rosa to be invited, not to the little diner where they had usually met, but to a building the young woman had never entered before. And when Rosa stepped into the vast space with its soaring ceilings and old paintings lining the corridors, she stopped abruptly at the threshold, her eyes widening in bewilderment, because everything before her was completely at odds with the image of the poor old woman in the faded coat whom she had believed she knew. Maureen was sitting there waiting for her, but she no longer wore the weary appearance of a destitute woman with nowhere to turn. Instead, she carried herself with a dignity and nobility Rosa had never seen, and only when she called the young woman closer in that same familiar, gentle voice did Rosa realize that the distinguished lady seated before her was the old woman she had risked herself to protect twice. Maureen took Rosa's cold hands in her own, and with all the sincerity of an aging heart that was still capable of being deeply moved, she slowly told her the entire truth, that she wasn't a poor old woman as Rosa had believed, but Maureen Kavanagh, the mother of the man who had taken her home safely that night, that the lavish gathering where Rosa had knelt beside her had actually been a party her son had arranged to find a wife, and that she had deliberately disguised herself as someone insignificant and fallen in the middle of the crowd to test every beautiful young woman competing for her son's attention, to see whether any of them would bend down to help someone they believed could offer them nothing in return. She explained that every one of those splendid women had stepped around her without so much as a glance, had laughed at her misfortune, and that only one person, a poor waitress in a worn uniform carrying the heavy weight of pregnancy, had crossed the entire room to kneel beside her and whisper the warmest words Maureen had heard throughout all her lonely years. Rosa listened to every word, and instead of the overwhelming joy any other young woman might have felt upon learning that she had earned the favor of one of the most powerful families in the city, confusion appeared upon her face, followed by alarm, and finally by such profound sorrow that tears gathered in her eyes. She pulled her hands away from Maureen's and stepped backward, then said in a trembling, choked voice that she wished Maureen had never told her any of this, that she would rather have continued believing she was merely a poor old woman in need of help. Rosa said that when she knelt beside her that night, and when she used her own body to shield her on the dark street, she had done those things only because Maureen was a human being who needed help, only because her heart wouldn't allow her to do otherwise, and never because she expected anything in return. Now that she knew who Maureen truly was, Rosa was terrified that everything she had done with complete sincerity would be mistaken for calculation, that people would believe she had shown kindness only to gain the wealth and power of the Kavanagh family. Through her tears, she said that she wanted nothing from Maureen's family, that she didn't want a single cent of their fortune, that the only thing she desired was to live honestly with her own conscience, and that she would rather return to her freezing rented room and the crushing burden of her debt than allow anyone to believe her kindness could be bought or sold. Maureen looked at the young woman crying before her, and instead of taking offense, her own aged eyes blurred with emotion. Because Rosa's reaction, her sorrow upon discovering that Maureen was a woman of power, her fear of being mistaken for someone seeking personal gain, was the final and most certain proof Maureen needed, proof that this young woman truly was the rare and precious jewel she had searched so long to find in a world filled with cold and calculating hearts. It was at that very moment, as Rosa stood sobbing in the middle of that unfamiliar room, wishing she could return to the honest poverty of her old life, rather than accept anything from a powerful family, that Ronan appeared in the hallway, and he remained silently at the threshold long enough to hear every word she had spoken, long enough to feel the genuine anguish tearing at her heart. For a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people always trying to cling to his wealth and power, people willing to do anything for the privilege of standing near the Kavanagh name, the sight of a young woman weeping because she feared being mistaken for someone driven by personal gain, a woman trying to reject the very opportunity to transform her life that countless others would have fought for until blood was spilled, was something beyond everything he understood about human nature. He stepped into the room, and when Rosa became aware of his presence, she hurriedly wiped away her tears and retreated in confusion like someone who had been discovered at the most vulnerable moment of her life. But Ronan spoke before she could say anything, and the voice that normally made the entire city tremble now carried a tenderness even his own mother had rarely heard. He told her that she didn't need to fear being misunderstood, because he, more than anyone else in the world, knew the difference between a sincere heart and calculated deception. He had witnessed so many carefully staged performances of kindness that he could recognize the real thing at first sight, and her reaction just now, her sorrow upon learning the truth, was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed in another human being. Then, with an openness he had never imagined himself capable of, Ronan told her about the wounds he had never revealed to anyone, about a past that had taught him that loving someone meant placing a knife in the hands of the world and giving it the power to drive that blade into his heart, about the losses that had made him build cold walls of stone around himself and resolve to spend the rest of his life in the solitude he had chosen. He told her that for all those years, he had believed the part of him capable of feeling had died long ago, buried forever alongside everything he had lost, until the night he stood on the balcony and saw a young woman cross an entire room to kneel beside someone everyone else believed wasn't worth noticing. As he spoke, Rosa listened with eyes still wet from tears, but the fear within them slowly gave way to a profound understanding, because she realized that the powerful man standing before her, though he lived in a world completely different from her own, carried wounds within him that were no different from hers. He too was a soul who had once been abandoned, who had learned not to trust anyone, who had sealed his heart because he was afraid of being hurt one more time. These two people, one standing at the very height of power and the other at the lowest edge of society, seemed to be separated by an impossible chasm, Yet in that moment, they realized that their hearts were touching through the pain they both understood, and the silence between them became strangely warm. The silence of two souls who had finally found someone capable of understanding them. Then, as though guided by something greater than reason, Ronan slowly moved closer to her, and with a hesitation completely unfamiliar in a man accustomed to commanding an entire empire, he gently extended his hand, pausing uncertainly in the air as though asking for her permission, before carefully resting his palm upon her pregnant belly. And at the very instant, his hand touched her, as though the tiny life within could sense his presence. The baby gave a faint little kick beneath his palm, a small movement of life. And Ronan Kavanagh, a man who had witnessed so much darkness in this world, suddenly felt his eyes begin to burn, because for the first time in all those years, he was touching something entirely pure and untouched, a new life that hadn't yet been stained by the cruelty of the world. And in that sacred moment, the final wall of stone around his heart quietly collapsed. But that warm and sacred moment, that rare peace the two wounded hearts had only just found, couldn't last long in the dangerous world. Ronan ruled, because the unseen figures behind that dark network had realized that his net was tightening around them with each passing day, that the man they wanted to overthrow yet feared had already uncovered too many clues, and they understood that unless they struck first, they would be the ones driven into a corner. And so they chose the cruelest move of all, a blow aimed directly at the one weakness a powerful man like Ronan could never fully defend. His mother, the woman who remained the only thread connecting him to whatever goodness still survived within his heart. One afternoon, as Maureen was leaving the church she regularly attended, while her guards were distracted by an incident that had been carefully staged, strangers suddenly descended upon her and carried her away within moments, leaving behind a chilling emptiness and a wave of horror that swept through the entire Kavanagh family when the terrible news arrived. Ronan learned that his mother had been abducted while he was with Rosa, and in that instant, his entire body seemed to turn to stone, because the old fear he had buried for so many years, the haunting terror of arriving too late once again to save someone he loved, suddenly rose and closed around his heart like a crushing hand. The kidnappers sent him a cold message, demanding that he withdraw from the investigation and leave their operation untouched, or he would lose his mother forever, and they gave him a merciless deadline in which to decide, forcing him into a brutal choice between the justice he was pursuing and the life of the only family he had left. As Ronan sank into despair and fury, using every resource at his command to discover where his mother was being held but finding himself blocked at every turn because her captors had concealed their trail too carefully, something happened that he never could have expected, something that became the turning point, capable of saving them all. In the middle of the night, a secret call came from the last person he would ever have imagined, Vanessa Sinclair, the arrogant young woman who had once stepped around his mother on the marble floor with a cold smile and the cruel remark that the old woman was nobody. Vanessa, with the sharpness and worldly cunning of a woman born into wealth and privilege, had known for some time about the dark schemes taking shape within her own family. She had quietly understood that her father and relatives were planning something involving the hidden network and the Kavanagh family, but she had always chosen to look away because those schemes promised to bring her family greater wealth and power. Yet when Vanessa discovered that her family's scheming had escalated from cold corporate greed into violent abduction and imminent murder, a sharp wave of panic broke through her polished exterior, driven not by a sudden blossoming of kindness, for she remained the same proud and calculating woman who felt no remorse for her past cruelty, but by a desperate dread of becoming an accomplice to a bloody crime that would shatter her own world. She placed a secret, anonymous call to Ronan in the dead of night. Her voice trembled with terror as she whispered the exact location of the warehouse and the details she had overheard, severing the line the moment the words left her lips. Having intervened only far enough to protect herself from being dragged into a murder investigation, she immediately stepped back into her cold, power-hungry life, continuing to look down on others as though that midnight call had never occurred. Armed with that crucial location, Ronan moved swiftly into the night. Soon, inside the suffocating shadows of the dark warehouse, he and the traitor faced each other with Maureen's life hanging in the balance between them. But an even darker escalation unfolded that no one had anticipated. The traitor's men, desperate to secure absolute leverage and realizing Rosa's profound connection to both Ronan and his mother, had ambushed her small apartment building shortly after capturing Maureen. They had dragged the terrified young woman to the desolate warehouse, binding her in a shadowed corner near the entrance to use her as the ultimate shield. As Rosa stood trapped in the darkness, her heart pounding violently inside her chest as she witnessed the terrifying scene unfolding before her. The overwhelming terror for the people she loved collided with the physical exhaustion her fragile body had endured for months. It was then, under the unbearable strain of the night, and everything her exhausted body had already been forced to carry, that a sudden, crushing pain of labor seized her, making her clutch the wall beside her to keep from collapsing as she realized her child was demanding to enter the world in the most dangerous moment of all. A cry escaped her lips before she could stop it, and the sound tore through the heavy silence of the warehouse, drawing every eye toward her and making both Ronan and the trader freeze in shock. In that fateful instant, Ronan Kavanagh faced the most brutal choice of his life, because before him stood the man who had betrayed him, the man who had threatened his mother, the man whose life he could end in that very moment and finally settle every grievance, while satisfying the fury that had raged inside him for so long. While behind him, in the corner of the room, was the woman he loved, writhing in pain, needing him more than ever, carrying within her a tiny life that was about to draw its first breath. The man Ronan had once been, the cold man shaped by all those years of darkness, would surely have chosen revenge and allowed rage to guide him. But the man standing there now, the man whose heart had been warmed and softened by a poor young woman, didn't hesitate for even a second. He turned his back on his enemy, turned away from the hunger for vengeance that had ruled him for so many years, and rushed toward Rosa, because he understood that some things in this world mattered more than revenge, that saving a new life held 1,000 times more meaning than ending the life of a man who had already lost his humanity. That choice, that moment when he tore himself free from the cycle of violence that had imprisoned him all his life, became the salvation of them all, because while the traitor still stood, stunned by Ronan's unimaginable decision, Ronan's loyal men moved quickly enough to overpower him, wrench the weapon from his hands, and free Maureen from his grasp, bringing the dark conspiracy he had so carefully woven to a final end. The moment she was free, Maureen hurried to Rosa's side with her son, and the seasoned woman, drawing upon all the composure and wisdom of someone who had lived through nearly an entire lifetime, quickly reassured the young woman, clasping her hand and gently telling her to breathe deeply and lean against her, promising that everything would be all right and that she would remain beside her. Ronan knelt at Rosa's side and held tightly to her other hand, and the man accustomed to commanding an empire was now nothing more than a human being desperately praying for the safety of the woman he loved. He whispered words of encouragement to her, telling her to be strong, telling her that he was there and wasn't going anywhere, telling her that she wasn't alone as she had always believed. His men quickly called for medical assistance, and they managed to take her where she needed to go in time. And throughout those tense and frightening hours, Ronan never once released her hand and never once looked away from her sweat-covered face, which still shone with the extraordinary strength of a woman fighting to bring a new life into the world. Then, after all the struggle and danger, after all the pain those two wounded souls had endured throughout their lives, the clearest and most miraculous sound of all rose through the air and shattered every lingering fear. The first cry of a newborn child, a fragile sound filled with life, a cry like a declaration that even amid all the darkness of this world, life and hope would always find a way to bloom. And in that moment, Rosa, Ronan, and Maureen all began to weep, not with tears of suffering, but with the overwhelming joy of a happiness none of them had ever dared to dream could belong to them. That first clear cry, that miraculous sound which had just torn through the darkness of all the months gone by, now echoed warmly through a room filled with gentle light, a place where every danger and fear had receded to make way for the peace that all three people in this story deserved after everything they had endured. Rosa lay there, her face still marked by exhaustion after giving birth, but her eyes shone with a radiance no one had ever seen in her before, the light of a mother holding her child for the first time. And when the tiny newborn was placed upon her chest, when she felt that fragile warmth and those first breaths resting against her skin, she began to cry, but these were the sweetest tears she had ever shed in a life that had known so many of them. She lowered her gaze to the tiny face of her child, whose eyes were tightly closed, studying every perfect little feature as though she were beholding a miracle, and she softly whispered the words she had carried within her for so many months, that her baby had finally arrived, that she had waited so long, and that from this day forward, her child would never, not for a single day, know the feeling of being abandoned that she herself had carried throughout her entire life. Ronan stood beside the bed, silently watching mother and child, and upon the face that had once been cold enough to terrify an entire city, there now appeared a tenderness no one who knew him could ever have imagined he possessed. Then Rosa looked up at him and gave a small nod, offering him her silent permission, and only then did he extend his hands, trembling slightly, to receive the baby. And that moment, when a man whose entire life had been steeped in darkness and violence cradled a tiny, innocent life in his large hands, handling the child with such care, as though he were holding the most precious and fragile thing in existence, became the most beautiful sight anyone who witnessed it could ever forget. Ronan lowered his gaze to the little face sleeping peacefully in his arms, and he felt something burst open inside his chest. Every wall of stone he had spent years building, every layer of coldness he had worn like armor, melted before this innocent life, and the man no one had ever seen shed a tear, suddenly realized that his cheeks were wet. He wept, not from pain or loss as he had during the rare moments of his dark past, but from a happiness and healing he had never dared believe life would grant him, because as he held the baby against his heart, he understood that he had finally found the part of himself he had believed dead for so long, and that he had chosen a way out of the endless cycle of hatred, choosing instead to become a man capable of love once more. Maureen stood quietly nearby, watching her son cradle the baby with tears filling his eyes, and the woman who had set this entire story in motion with a deliberate fall months ago couldn't hold back her own emotion, because she understood that what she had searched for all this time wasn't merely a wife for her son, but a heart capable of warming and redeeming his frozen one, and now she had witnessed that miracle become real before her own eyes. Rosa watched them, watched the powerful man holding her child with such tenderness and such honest tears, and something within her own heart, a heart wounded and hardened by so many abandonments, finally began to open. For the first time in her life, the young woman who had always believed she was the kind of person anyone could easily turn away from and leave behind, the woman who had never dared believe she deserved to be loved, now allowed herself to believe, to hope, to let her heart accept that perhaps, just perhaps, she too deserved a home, a love, and a place where she could finally belong. And when Ronan carried the baby back toward her, when he sat beside the bed and the three of them gathered close in the warm light of the room, they formed a picture none of them had ever dared to dream of, the picture of a family, the simple thing each of them had longed for throughout their entire lives, which had now finally become real. Time passed like a gentle river after a violent storm, and the months that followed brought the three people in this story a life each of them had once believed would forever remain beyond reach, a life filled with peace, love, and a true home that both Rosa and Ronan had longed for throughout their entire lives. The dark network hiding behind the Kavanagh family name was completely dismantled by Ronan. The suffering people who had once been trapped in its crushing grip of debt were finally set free, and the Kavanagh name, the name he had fought so hard to keep unstained by the suffering of the innocent, was restored to the honor and integrity it deserved. As for Vanessa Sinclair, the proud woman who had once stepped around an elderly lady lying on the marble floor with a cold smile, even though she had experienced one rare moment of conscience that helped save everyone, she remained unchanged in the end. She returned to the glittering and heartless world where she belonged, still looking down upon those she considered beneath her, because there are lessons that some people refuse to learn no matter how many times life places them directly before their eyes, and the coldness within their hearts remains as hard and unyielding as stone. But Rosa remained the same Rosa she had always been. Even though she now had a home, a man who loved her with all his heart, and a child to cherish, she never lost the most beautiful part of who she was, the heart that always reached toward those in need, and she continued to be the woman willing to walk against the flow of an entire crowded room to kneel beside anyone who had fallen, not because she expected anything in return, but simply because her heart had been born to do so. And perhaps that is the most beautiful message this story hopes to leave with each of us, that a person's true worth has never been measured by the position they hold, the wealth they possess, or the glittering appearance the world so often admires, but by the way they treat those who can offer them nothing in return, by the kindness they are still willing to give even when they themselves have almost nothing left to offer. Because the truest kindness isn't something we share only when our lives are overflowing with abundance. It is what we somehow manage to preserve within ourselves even during the darkest days of our lives. This world can sometimes be unbearably harsh, and not all of us will be fortunate enough to find an ending as beautiful as Rosa's, but it is the souls who still know how to bend down beside the vulnerable, who are willing to walk against the crowd in order to protect their compassion, who truly make this world worth living in. And perhaps the small act of kindness we offer today may one day, when we least expect it, find its way back to us and illuminate our entire lives in the most miraculous way. If the story of Rosa and Ronan has touched something deep within your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this story so that together we can continue listening to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. We would also love to hear your thoughts. How did you feel about this young woman's journey? Which moment touched your heart most deeply? Please leave a few words in the comments so we can hear the most sincere feelings from the depths of your heart. Thank you for giving us your precious time and staying with this story until its final moments. We wish you and all those you love lasting health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to meeting you again in the stories to come.